Imagine it's 29 June 2015. You are a 42-year-old pharmacy owner living in Athens, Greece. Your apartment sits above your shop, and the metal shutters tremble every time the first bus grinds up the street. Most of your savings are in a local bank, not because you love banks, but because suppliers want transfers. Your landlord wants rent, and your daughter's school wants fees paid on time. Monday usually begins with simple rituals. Lift the shutter, sweep the dust from the doorway, stack painkillers beside the register, and check which customers still need to pay you back. You have already lived through years of cuts, tax hikes, and speeches about recovery, but you still believe the worst has probably passed, because that is what people in suits keep saying on television. Tonight the refrigerator hums, your ledger lies open on the kitchen table, and your bank card rests beside your keys, like a promise that tomorrow will be ordinary. If you have ever wondered why financial disaster almost never arrives in the shape people expect, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has appeared in different countries, under different flags, with different excuses. And if this kind of historical clarity helps you see the world a little earlier than everyone else, subscribing is a small act that may change the way you read the next calm headline. Then your phone lights up. Greek banks are shutting. Cash withdrawals from ATMs will be limited to 60 euros a day. By the time dawn reaches the street, a line is formed outside the machine around the corner. And the line is silent in the strange way people go silent when they already know shouting will not help. In the first half of 2015, Greek banks had already lost 47.6 billion euros in deposits, about 27.5% of their deposit base, as fear spread and money fled before rules could trap it. Now the trap is visible. You're not watching a stock chart collapse in New York. You're not seeing traders scream on a dealing floor in London. You're standing in Athens, holding a plastic card that still says you have money, while the system tells you that money can no longer move the way it moved yesterday. That is the heart of this video. The next crash will not look like the last one, because every society prepares for the previous disaster and leaves another door unlocked. History shows that collapse changes costume. Sometimes it looks like prices exploding. Sometimes it looks like a currency snapping. Sometimes it looks like mortgages, repo desks, or pension funds. Sometimes it looks like an ATM that works, but only on ration. The face changes. The mechanism underneath does not. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A crash is not just a day when markets fall. A crash is the moment a system stops hiding its losses. Think of an old house with fresh paint on the walls. From the street, it looks safe, but inside the beams, termites have been eating for years. The day the floor gives way is dramatic, but the real story is the slow, quiet damage that came first. In finance, that hidden damage usually has three parts. The first is too much leverage, which means using borrowed money to make life or profits look bigger than they really are. The second is maturity mismatch, which is a technical phrase for a simple problem. Long promises are being funded by short trust. Money can leave today, but the assets backing it may take years to pay. The third is concentration. Too many people depend on the same asset, the same funding source, the same story. Once faith cracks, everyone rushes for the same narrow exit. That is why the next crash rarely copies the last one. People put sandbags where the last flood entered. Regulators tighten the last weak rule. Banks avoid the last toxic instrument. Investors swear they have learned. But risk is like water in a damaged ship. Block one hole and it finds another seam. What changes from era to era is not human nature. It is where the promises sit, who believes them, and who ends up holding the loss when the music stops. This brings us directly to our first case. Germany in 1923 did not crash the way modern viewers imagine a crash. There was no app notification telling savers their portfolio was down 7% before breakfast. There was something worse. The money itself was dying in people's hands. The roots of the disaster stretched back before 1923. Germany had left the gold standard during the First World War, borrowed heavily, lost the war, and then faced reparation demands under the Treaty of Versailles. The state was squeezed from both sides. It needed to spend, but it could not raise enough honest revenue. So it did what weak states have done across history when tax receipts fail and borrowing dries up. It printed. At first, this looked manageable. Then it became a monster. Britannica notes that by July 1922, prices had risen roughly 700%. Then came 1923. French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr in January. The German government backed passive resistance and paid workers even as production collapsed. That was like trying to heat a house by burning the floorboards. By July 1st, 1923, the mark had fallen to 160,000 to the dollar. By October 1st, it was 242 million to the dollar. By November 20th, it was 4.2 trillion to the dollar. Read those numbers slowly. A currency is supposed to help people store work from the past and carry it safely into the future. In Weimar Germany, the bridge itself was disintegrating while people were still walking across it. Now here is where it gets interesting. Hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money loses value faster than people can spend it, does not feel like one clean explosion. It feels like daily life turning to sand. Pensioners saw a lifetime of saving disappear. Middle-class families who had done everything they were told to do found that prudence had become a trap. Workers were paid, then ran to shops before prices changed again. Shopkeepers could not restock fast enough. Farmers refused to sell food for money that would be nearly worthless by nightfall. Barter returned. Food riots broke out. One student remembered ordering a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks, and then seeing the second cup cost 7,000 before he finished the first. That is what collapse looks like when it enters through the currency rather than the bank. The state does not padlock your account. It simply hollows out what the account means. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Not everyone lost. Debtors with real assets often found their burdens erased in real terms. Some businessmen and industrialists, especially those tied to goods, foreign currency, or hard assets, could move faster than the middle class trapped in cash and fixed incomes. The same storm that drowned savers floated a few heavily indebted asset holders back to shore. That detail matters because it tells us something cold about crisis. A crash is never just destruction. It is also redistribution. Losses do not vanish. They move. In Weimar Germany, they moved onto people who trusted the currency, held pensions, and believed stability was something a nation could announce into existence. The crash did not look like 2008. It did not need to. The state had found another way to force the public to absorb the bill. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your country's banks looked solid, your government budget looked disciplined, and your streets were full of new towers and new cars, would you believe a crisis was still possible? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what happened next in Asia in 1997 is the part of this story that still catches people off guard, and it changes the way you see strength itself. In the early 1990s, Thailand looked like a success story. So did much of East and Southeast Asia. Growth rates were high, savings were strong, construction cranes filled the skyline, international money poured in because the future seemed obvious. In Bangkok, entire districts rose like concrete forests after rain. The trouble was not visible from the street. It sat in the balance sheets behind the glass. For years, domestic credit had grown fast. Real estate values swelled. Banks and companies borrowed heavily in foreign currency, especially dollars, because dollar funding looked cheap and safe. Why did it look safe? Because exchange rates had been kept stable for so long that many people treated the peg as permanent. A peg is a managed exchange rate, a promise that your currency will stay close to another one. It can feel like an anchor. In bad times, it can become an anvil. On July 5, 1997, Thailand finally abandoned the bahts, pegged to the dollar after months of pressure had drained reserves. That was the moment the mask slipped. What looked like a local currency move became a regional panic. Look at what happened next. Thailand's weakness quickly spread to Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and South Korea. The Federal Reserve history of the crisis describes it as a twin balance of payments and banking crisis. That sounds technical. In plain English, it means countries had trouble getting the foreign money they needed, while banks at home were also cracking. Years of rapid credit growth, weak supervision, and short-term foreign borrowing had created a system that only worked if confidence stayed high. Once investors pulled back, currencies weakened, debts became harder to repay, and the local currency value of dollar debts jumped like a trap snapping shut. Imagine earning in baht or rupiah, but owing in dollars. The exchange rate falls, and suddenly the same debt becomes a much larger mountain without you borrowing a single extra coin. That is what many firms faced. Indonesia fell into a deep economic and political crisis. South Korea came close to default. The international community assembled huge support packages, with total loans of about $118 billion for Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, while the IMF alone provided $36 billion to the three worst-hit countries. Those are rescue numbers, but behind them stood ordinary lives. Shops cut prices in desperate attempts to attract customers whose spending power had collapsed. Businesses with healthy sales on paper could still die because their debts had mutated overnight. Families saw imported goods become suddenly unaffordable. Workers lost jobs, not because demand vanished in some natural way, but because the financial plumbing beneath the economy had cracked. And this is where the pattern sharpens. Asia in 1997 was not Weimar Germany with different flags. No one was paying for bread with wheelbarrows of cash. The currencies still existed. The banks still had buildings. The headlines were about devaluation, reserves, and IMF programs. But underneath, the core mechanism was familiar. Too many promises had been built on a fragile base of short-term funding and misplaced faith. In Germany, the weak point was the currency itself. In Asia, it was the belief that borrowed foreign money could safely fund domestic booms forever. The crisis did not arrive in the form people had practiced for. It arrived through the exchange rate. That is why people missed it. They were looking for a fire in the kitchen while the rot was spreading in the basement beams. The United States in 2008 offers the third version of the same old story, and it may be the one most viewers know best. But even here, the details matter, because 2008 was not simply a repeat of earlier banking panics. The trouble did not begin with citizens lining up outside neighborhood branches. It began in the hidden plumbing of modern finance, in a world of mortgage pools, short-term funding, and institutions that behave like banks without looking like the banks people remembered from history books. Throughout the early 2000s, cheap credit and new financial engineering pushed home prices higher. Mortgage debt held by U.S. households rose from 61% of GDP in 1998 to 97% in 2006. Lenders moved away from the old model of keeping loans on their own books. Instead, they made loans, bundled them into securities, sold them onward, and told everyone the risk had been spread safely through the system. That sounded modern. In practice, it meant responsibility had been sliced up, repackaged, and disguised. When it was like turning one cracked mirror into 1,000 polished tiles and pretending the crack had vanished. By mid-2006, national home prices had peaked. In 2007, losses on mortgage-linked assets began to spread stress through global markets. Then came the moments people now remember. On March 12, 2008, Bear Stearns effectively lost access to the repo market, which is a short-term borrowing market that large firms use the way a corner shop uses the cash drawer at the end of the day. On September 7th, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were placed into federal conservatorship. On September 15th, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. After that, fear raced through the system like air through broken pipes. Money market funds wobbled. Commercial paper markets seized. AIG needed support. Citigroup and Bank of America needed help. What people call a banking crisis was, in reality, a crisis of collateral, confidence, and funding chains so tangled that almost nobody could see where the losses ended. The United States lost 4.3% of GDP from peak to trough. Unemployment went from less than 5% to 10%. Behind those numbers were emptied retirement accounts, foreclosure notices, and kitchen tables where families calculated which bill could be postponed one more week. The crash did not take the form of currency death. It did not take the form of a classic sovereign default. It looked like a mortgage market problem until it became a map of every hidden connection in modern finance. And notice something else. The homeowners with the weakest credit were not the only people damaged. Construction workers, delivery drivers, restaurant owners, recent graduates, and retirees all got pulled into the blast. That is because modern leverage works like dry timber in a forest. A single spark begins in one patch, but the fire follows every line of connection. Mortgage losses hit structured products. Structured products hit banks and shadow banks. Funding freezes hit employers. Employers cut jobs. Jobs vanish, and then even people who never owned a risky mortgage fall behind. The system had convinced millions that risk was dispersed, which means spread out and harmless. In truth, it had simply been diffused until nobody felt responsible for it. When the shock came, the whole structure behaved like a glass bridge built on rotten cables. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand because the surface always looks calmer than the machinery below it. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they almost never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. Germany in 1923, Asia in 1997, America in 2008, the same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In every case, a society built more claims on wealth than the underlying system could safely honor. In every case, that fragility was hidden for years by a story people wanted to believe. In Germany, the story was that the state could spend past its limits and the mark would somehow endure. In Asia, the story was that exchange rate stability and fast growth made foreign borrowing safe. In the United States, the story was that housing prices would keep rising and securitization had made finance safer by spreading risk. Different language, same structure, too much leverage, too much short-term trust, too much dependence on the idea that tomorrow would behave like yesterday. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Crashes are not carbon copies because losses can be assigned to different places. Sometimes savers pay through inflation. Sometimes workers and borrowers pay through recession and unemployment. Sometimes depositors pay through capital controls or haircuts, which is a sterile word for taking part of their money. Sometimes taxpayers pay through bailouts. Sometimes shareholders are wiped out. Sometimes all of the above happen in sequence. This is why the next crash will not look like the last one. The last crisis teaches regulators and investors where the previous leak was. They patch that leak, then congratulate themselves while pressure builds somewhere else. After old-fashioned bank runs, governments strengthened deposit insurance. After inflationary episodes, central banks became more focused on price stability. After 2008, capital rules on banks tightened. But risk did not retire. It migrated into sovereign debt, shadow banking, pension structures, uninsured deposits, property markets, and the quieter corners of finance where maturity mismatches still thrive. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank failed after unrealized bond losses met a deposit base that was more than 94% uninsured at the end of 2022. That was not 2008 returning in the same clothes. It was a new reminder that the form changes faster than the habit that creates it. The habit is simple. People stretch for return, governments stretch for time, and institutions stretch short funding over long promises until one small change in confidence turns into a system-wide verdict. And this leads us to the human side of the story, which is where history stops being abstract. The people hit hardest are usually not the gamblers at the center of the boom. They are the people standing nearest the exits when the doors jam. In Argentina, on December 3, 2001, the government imposed the corralito, limiting cash withdrawals to 250 pesos or dollars per week in order to stop money from fleeing the banks. Think about what that means in daily life. Your money is still yours on paper, but wages, rent, medicine, groceries, and bus fare do not happen on paper. They happen in days and hours. Argentina's crisis then spiraled into riots, a state of siege, the resignation of President Fernando de la Rua, and a rapid chain of presidents that turned the presidency into a revolving door. By February 2002, unemployment had reached 22%. Reports from that period say over half the country fell below the poverty line. That is what a crash looks like when convertibility, the one-to-one link between peso and dollar, breaks, and the banking system cannot honor the social contract, that cash will be there when people need it. Cyprus in 2013 showed another version. Deposits under 100,000 euros were protected. Deposits above that line at Bank of Cyprus took a 47.5% hit, converted into shares as part of a bail-in. At Laiki, many large depositors saw most of their uninsured savings disappear. The people hardest hit included pension funds linked to state companies and private savers who had believed a bank account was a parking place, not a battlefield. Greece in 2015 looked different again. Banks closed from June 28th, and though they eventually reopened on July 20th, cash withdrawals were capped at 60 euros a day during the bank holiday. Small businesses could not pay overseas suppliers normally. Families learned that electronic balances and usable money are not always the same thing. And Japan, after 1990, reminds us that some crashes do not roar. They seep. Equity prices fell about 60% by mid-1992. Land prices kept falling through the 1990s and early 2000s, and banks spent years dragging non-performing loans behind them like chains. There was no one mourning when everyone understood the nation had entered a lost decade. That was the point. Slow crashes wear people down differently. Promotions disappear, small firms stop hiring, young adults inherit caution instead of optimism. A society can be wounded by one violent break or by a decade of economic frost. Now observe who bears the first blow in almost every case. It is usually the person who needs the system to work today, not eventually. A pensioner cannot wait for a macroeconomic plan. A shop owner cannot tell a supplier that a rescue package is being negotiated. A parent cannot feed children with a central bank statement. This is why crashes feel so cruel from the ground. The language at the top is always delayed and abstract. Liquidity support, restructuring, fiscal adjustment, burden sharing. But the language at street level is immediate. The card did not work. The rent is due. The medicine shipment did not arrive. The customer cannot pay. The middle class often ends up as the shock absorber between elite access and deep poverty. The rich are more likely to have foreign accounts, lawyers, hard assets, and time. The very poor often had little savings to seize in the first place. It is the clerks, teachers, shopkeepers, retirees, and salaried professionals who discover that their caution did not make them safe. It simply made them stationary when the floor shifted. Look again at Argentina. A family may have spent years doing the respectable thing, keeping earnings in the bank, paying bills on time, avoiding speculation, trusting the one-to-one peso peg because it had become part of the country's mental furniture. Then the corralito turned bank deposits into a painting of money behind glass. You could see it, you could point to it, but you could not use it freely. That gap between legal ownership and practical access is where social trust dies. The same logic appeared in Cyprus, where a line drawn at 100,000 euros decided which deposits were sacred and which were sacrificial. It appeared in Greece, where pensioners and small firms found that a bank card was suddenly a ration coupon. It appeared in Japan in slower form, where nominal safety hid years of falling land values, weak banks, and businesses that stayed alive but stopped investing, hiring, and raising wages. A slow crash can be just as punishing because it steals time instead of cash. It turns a decade into a waiting room. And who comes through first? Often, not the smartest people, but the most mobile. In inflationary episodes, people with foreign currency, inventory, or debt tied to yesterday's money can move faster than people on fixed incomes. In currency crises, exporters with foreign earnings and lower mismatch between what they owed and what they earned may bend without breaking, while domestic firms drown. In banking crises, The institutions and households with spare cash, simpler liabilities, and fewer forced decisions gain precious time. Time is the hidden asset in every crash. It is the life raft nobody values enough during the boom. Once panic begins, time separates those who can wait from those who must accept whatever terms the system offers. That is why asset holders with flexibility can sometimes buy property, shares, or whole businesses cheaply after the damage is done, while wage earners are still trying to cover groceries and transport. The river does not just flood, it changes the map of who stands on dry land. This is also why official stories after a crash can sound so strange to the people who lived through it. Policymakers may say the system was stabilized. On paper, that can be true, but a stabilized system is not the same as a healed society. Germany stabilized the currency. Asia eventually recovered. America stopped the free fall. Greece reopened banks. Cyprus recapitalized lenders. Japan kept institutions standing. Yet the memory ordinary people carried away was not one of elegant policy design. It was the memory of betrayal by routine. The routine paycheck, the routine bank transfer, the routine house value. The routine belief that tomorrow's money would resemble today's. Once that routine breaks, people do not forget. They become more cautious, more political, or more cynical. Sometimes they pull away from institutions. Sometimes they embrace stronger ones. Sometimes they search for scapegoats. And this is where history gets dangerous, because financial trauma rarely stays financial. It seeps into elections, family decisions, birth rates, trust in neighbors, trust in foreigners, and trust in the future itself. A crash is never only about balance sheets. It is also about what a society learns to fear after the numbers stop moving. Who comes through these episodes relatively intact? Not perfect people, not prophets. Usually, it is the people in firms that depended the least on one single promise. In Weimar Germany, those with access to real goods, foreign currency, or productive assets often adapted faster than cash savers. In Asia, businesses with less dollar debt and stronger balance sheets had a better chance of surviving the currency snap. In the United States after 2008, households with stable income, lower leverage, and some liquid savings could endure the credit freeze better than those balanced on the thinnest edge. History is merciless on this point. The middle class often believes it is protected because it followed the rules, but in many crises, the middle class is exactly where hidden fragility lands first. Pensioners, salary earners, small shop owners, and ordinary depositors trust systems because daily life requires trust. That trust is useful in normal times. In abnormal times, it can become dry grass waiting for a spark. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. First, they were hard to trap in one box. They did not rely on one bank, one asset, one employer, one currency story, or one official reassurance. This was not always because they were rich. Often it was because they were cautious, practical, and emotionally unwilling to bet their whole future on a single institution. Second, they valued liquidity and flexibility. Liquidity is just a dry word for room to move. It means having some part of life that can absorb a shock without forcing immediate surrender. In crisis after crisis, the people who survived best were not always the people with the highest returns before the crash. They were the people who could stay standing when others were forced to sell, forced to borrow, or forced to beg. Third, they understood that real value does not live only in financial statements. It lives in useful skills, reliable income, community trust, adaptable businesses, and assets tied to real human need. A bakery, a farm, a repair shop, a stable export business, a profession people still require in hard times. These things have often outlived paper wealth that once looked untouchable. Notice what is missing from that list. Genius, perfect timing, crystal balls. The survivors of past crashes were rarely the loudest voices in the room. They were the people who treated stability as something fragile, not something promised. They read official calm with a skeptical eye. They knew that when everyone says a risk is impossible, that is often the moment the system has started leaning on it the hardest. This is not financial advice. It is pattern recognition from a long historical record. History suggests that resilience usually looks boring before the crisis and wise after it. It looks like less debt when debt is fashionable. It looks like simpler balance sheets when complexity is praised. It looks like holding some dry powder, which means spare capacity, while others use every last inch of runway. Collapse is not always a meteor. Sometimes it is a tide. The people who fare best are often the ones already living on slightly higher ground. So return with me to Athens. The pharmacy owner from the start of the story wakes before sunrise, walks to the ATM, and joins the line. The machine still works. That is what makes the scene so chilling. The screen glows. The keypad responds. The account exists. Yet each withdrawal is rationed, and every euro now has a task before it even leaves the machine. Suppliers call, customers ask for medicine on credit. The bank holiday that began on June 28th is supposed to buy time for the system. For ordinary people, it buys uncertainty. Eventually, the banks reopen. The city does not vanish. The lights stay on, but normal life has been cut open, and what spills out is a truth most people never forget once they have seen it. A financial system is not a vault. It is a chain of promises. And when enough pressure hits the chain, someone always discovers that a promise and a guarantee are not the same thing. That is the final lesson. The next crash will not look like the last because systems learn defensively, not wisely. They build seawalls where the previous wave hit, while the ocean studies a different part of the coast. History shows recurring ingredients: high debt, concentrated bets, short-term funding, political delay, and a public trained to mistake calm for safety. Today, the world carries enormous debt burdens, and one 2024 estimate put global debt above $315 trillion, roughly 333% of world GDP. Higher interest rates have already exposed weak points in regional banks, commercial property, and heavily leveraged corners of finance. None of that tells us the date, the country, or the exact trigger of the next crisis. It tells us something more useful. We should stop expecting history to repeat as a photograph. It repeats more like a rhyme. The tune is familiar. The words are different. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.